All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Headwaters Science Center. My name is Ryan. I'm one of the educators here, and it is 3:30, which means it is time for one of our 3:30 after-school STEM shows. And so, if you haven't been watching, we do these shows every single day at 3:30, 7 days a week. And basically, what we do is one of the educators that we have here at the Science Center comes up, pulls together some materials, and talks about some sort of sciencey adjacent topic. So you can tune in any day at 3:30. The topic's different every day. The educator's different every day. I'm actually subbing in for Chuck, so this isn't normally my day, but I say you tune in on a Friday, you might get Chuck. You tune in on a Tuesday, you might get James. Any other day in between, who knows? And today, what we're going to be talking about is kind of a interesting subject, a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart as somebody who's got a background in archaeology and paleobiology. But we're going to be talking about the idea of extinction and kind of what leads up to an extinction, what are the effects of an extinction, why do things go extinct. And so I have around me, can't see on the floor back here, but around me, a mishmash of examples of different creatures that are in varying states of extinction or near extinction or not so near extinction. And I think what we're going to do is we're just going to go through and we're going to take a look at some of these creatures. We're going to use them as examples of a few different ways that things kind of end up in this position. And so I do have a live audience here, so Twitch chat, if you want to lob out any questions or answer any questions, you're welcome to, but I also do have a live audience here, so they'll probably beat you to the punch because they're going to hear it a couple seconds before you do. But like I said, feel free to answer and feel free to lob out any questions too. I love getting interrupted during these things because it means you guys are engaged. So I guess first off, most basic question, extinction is a word that you've probably heard, but what does it mean for something to be extinct? What's that term mean? Anybody?
The species no longer exists on this planet.
The species no longer exists on this planet. It's a good definition. I'm willing to run with that definition. So yeah, when something goes extinct, it means that is a type of being that cannot be found anywhere on the planet anymore. And you'll see things that are extinct. You'll also see every once in a while, if you're somebody who's looking up conservation statuses of things, you'll occasionally see extinct in the wild. IETW as a status too, which means that's an animal that, or a plant, or any living thing, that can no longer be found in the wild but is still around in human care to some degree. There's a number of things like that. The most famous example of that probably in recent history is there was a, what kind of tortoise was it? There was one of the South American kind of Galapagos-y tortoises that was the last one of its kind for decades and decades and decades that lived in a zoo, and it actually passed several years ago, I guess, at this point. But his name was it Lonesome George? He was the last of his kind and died at 110 years old some years ago. And so he was kind of the face, the like marquee IETW animal, extinct in the wild for years and years when I was growing up. But like I said, you also have kind of a more general extinction where you have things that just don't exist really anywhere anymore as far as we know. And I've got a few examples of those types of things here. The most obvious one, and probably, again, kind of a face of extinction in general, are dinosaurs. And I think dinosaurs are a great example to start with. One, because people know them, people are familiar with them, people very much associate with them with extinction, and they're also something that's really associated with what we would call a mass extinction, where you have an event where all of a sudden you have a ton of different things that all go to extinct all at once. And those types of things have happened on a number of different occasions over the life cycle of this planet, where I said you have, if you were paying attention and watching last week, we talked about the Great Oxidation event that happened maybe, oh boy, I don't even remember at this point anymore. You have the Great Oxidation event where the whole chemistry of the atmosphere changes because photosynthetic things become a thing, and it ends up killing off like 98% of the species that exist on the planet. So by comparison, you know, the dinosaur extinction, the Cretaceous extinction is relatively small, but they still have a very profound impact on what comes afterwards, because leading up to dinosaurs for, what, 200 million years, you have these big, bulky reptiles that are dominating the ecosystem everywhere, and you don't see that anymore. Like, the biggest reptiles we have around these days are like crocodiles, and, you know, by comparison, a crocodile ain't much compared to a, you know, ceratopsid or a stegosaurus. And instead of these big reptiles, what we have are these big mammals that do very similar things. You know, an elephant fills a very similar role to a ceratopsid, but the elephant wouldn't have ever had a chance to do that if the ceratopsids hadn't gone extinct. So these mass extinctions are really important to happen every once in a while because they kind of reset. And what you tend to see over the course of, between these mass extinctions is you see, stuff kind of gets reset. The generalists make it through. The really specialized stuff all dies off because if you think about it, if you're an animal that has really, really, really committed a lot of time to being really good at like eating this one thing and being really good at getting that one thing, and then that thing goes away, what do? You just die. And then that opens the door to, more opportunities for the animals that aren't as hyper specialized. And then as time goes on, you see that specialization real happen. You tend to see things get bigger over time as well. And so you kind of hit a critical mass where you have all these really big hyper specialists, and then another extinction happens and everything kind of resets again. And that's happened, like I said, a bunch of times over the course of Earth's history. And so what happened to the dinosaurs? Still somewhat debated. General consensus is you have some sort of large meteor impact that happens, probably down in what is now modern-day Mexico, down by the Yucatan Peninsula. Creates a big dust cloud that has a pretty dramatic change in the atmosphere of the Earth, creates a cooling period where all these big reptiles couldn't survive. And so climate change is going to be a theme that you're going to hear a lot, especially when it comes to these big mass extinctions. Climate change is usually the cause, because most effective way to kill off a bunch of stuff is to change the environment that they're living in. So that's true with dinosaurs. That's even going to be true with things like our mammoth to a certain degree, which is what this is representative of. Obviously, you can't bring a whole mammoth in here, but we do have kind of a cool little artifact here. So this is, anybody know what bone that is? You recognize that? It's not a hip, but I can see that. It is a shoulder blade, scapula. And so mammoths, like I said, are something that was probably filling a very similar niche to a thing like a Ceratopsid or a Stegosaurus, this big, bulky, heavy-bodied herbivore. And again, they end up facing a very similar fate where they were something that was very specifically designed for this one specific environment, eating this one type of thing. And then the last glacial period ends, and all of a sudden being giant and covered in fur is not that great of a model anymore. And all of a sudden, the amount of environments you can survive in shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and then humans come and also start hunting you, and there you go. And again, humans, another thing you're going to start hearing as a theme pretty regularly. And so the mammoths are an example of, we talked about how when the dinosaurs kind of die off, it opens up this niche to basically mammals to come in and start filling a bunch of the same roles that the dinosaurs once did. And the term you'll hear for a lot of those are megafauna. So mega, big, fauna, animals. And typically you hear that referred to as like these post-dinosaur kind of pre-human mammals is usually where it's phrased. And you don't really see megafauna around anymore, especially like in the Americas. Really the only one we have left that kind of gets classified into that group are bison. And bison are specifically locally, it's a kind of marquee example of an animal that has had a really interesting conservation status over time. So bison, for most of recorded history, were very prevalent. They made it all the way, like almost all the way up to the East Coast, and were very prevalent out in the plains, and we're obviously right around Bemidji here. But then European colonists arrive in the Americas and start hunting them, and all of a sudden you see their range shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink to the point where in like the late 1800s they're almost completely extinct. And some of that is just bad care, it's just bad practices, overhunting just for the sake of like, yeah, we need meat and leather and stuff like that. But some of it, unfortunately, is also kind of a concerted effort that happens, particularly with the bison. Kind of some dark side of American history there is the U.S. government in the mid-1800s recognizes that a lot of, particularly the Plains tribes, like the Sioux in particular, are giving them a lot of trouble as far as kind of settling that area with European settlers. And someone in the government had the bright idea. They said, hey, these tribes rely a lot on these. They eat the meat, they use the fur, they use the leather, they do a ton of stuff with this one specific creature here. So what if we just put out a bounty on them and just told people to kill them whenever they see them, because we want them to be extinct, and because if they're extinct, life is going to be really hard for the Sioux, and they're going to be much more likely to do what we want them to do. And so from like the mid to late 1800s, you see a massive, massive die-off of the bison. specifically for that reason. And very probably famous image that comes out of that is this one that you've maybe seen. And then for context, what we're looking at here is a pile of bison skulls. And you'll see I've colored one in orange there, so that's one skull that I've colored in. And so those are the skulls that were at one plant in, I think it was Detroit, and those were ground up into fertilizer, is what happened to those skulls. But you see, the rate at which these animals are being hunted down, and like I said, they're using them. They're not just killing them and leaving them dead out in the wild generally. You'll collect them and bring them in for, as they're making factories. You need leather for your belts in your factories and stuff like that. Like I said, there's a concerted effort to target the specific animal for that reason, and so it's rare to see a situation where humans have specifically gone out and said, yeah, we want to eliminate that population of animals. You don't see that very often, but we happen to have a local one right here in the bison where that exactly happened to. And I think that's history that's worth knowing about and worth remembering. But it's not always completely intentional. Sometimes animals or plants can just be a victim of general sort of human encroachment or human practices. Like I said, not necessarily deliberate. We're trying to make this thing extinct means, but just in a they're in the way of what we're trying to do means. And so gorillas, I think, are a great example of that, where they're very, very endangered at the moment. Any species of gorilla, there's three species of gorilla that are alive right now, and all of them are critically endangered, largely due to habitat destruction because of where they are is close to where people want to be making farmland, and so their habitat keeps getting destroyed. The other thing is poaching with them. In particular, not as much of a thing anymore, but go back a couple decades and there was a real trendy item amongst the world's wealthy folks where gorilla hand ashtrays were a thing. So you would kill the gorilla, cut the hands off, and make an ashtray out of it, and do nothing with the rest of the gorilla. So they saw their population decrease pretty dramatically as a product of, like I said, habitat destruction, but also deliberate poaching for the sake of a luxury item. Keep working this way. Was it one of you guys that said the Saber-Tooth Tigers are one of your favorite animals? Or was that one of the other groups that was here? Must have been the other group. And so, kind of going back, we're back dealing with our mammoth era post-dinosaur kind of megafauna here. And we talked a little bit about how if you're a creature that is like really hyper specialized for hunting one specific thing, when that thing starts going away, all of a sudden you're in trouble. Saber-toothed cats are an example of that, where you don't see very many megafauna around anymore. Ain't too many of them. And when you're a large singular predator who has giant teeth that are specifically there to puncture a thick furry hide of a thickly coated, heavily fatted large mammal and really do nothing else, when that stuff starts going away, all of a sudden those big teeth are just an impediment because they break, and then you're out of luck. And so you start seeing the saber-toothed cats go away pretty much at the same time as the big herbivorous megafauna go away. Too specialized to live through a mass extinction. And finally, and actually, let's bring our bison back out. Another interesting bit of bison lore here. So, does anybody recognize these? Human? Kind of a monkey. Ape. But I'm glad he just said human, because hotly contested. How do you define a human? So here we have Homo sapiens sapiens, anatomically modern human. This is a Cro-Magnon. Here we have Homo sapiens neanderthalis, Neanderthal. So, depending on who you talk to, human, yes. But Neanderthals are a group of close human relations that we don't see around anymore. We don't have Neanderthals. They don't exist. Which is weird to think about. Like, there's a point in history where you have another, like, mostly distinct species of humans that's like walking around and living in the same areas that Homo sapiens sapiens were. Which is I don't know. I just think that's something I can't really wrap my brain around. Is like, what if there was just another species that like did pretty much all the same stuff we did and looked mostly like we did, but were just like a little like shorter and heavier? It was a real time in history. But like I said, we don't see Neanderthals around anymore. They are generally considered to be extinct. Except the other end of this is, depending on who you talk to, we don't really see Homo sapiens sapiens around anymore either. They're kind of thought to be extinct too. Because what we have seen here is probably, rather than one necessarily directly out competing the other one for the same resources or whatever, what you saw was a mixing of these populations where we had two separate distinct populations that now come together and have largely become one species, which is us. And generally we still consider ourselves to be Homo sapiens sapiens, but for years and years and years it was thought of that Homo sapiens sapiens just came and outcompeted the Neanderthals and kind of eliminated them on that regard. But over the last couple decades, it's become more and more apparent that that's not necessarily what happened, and that these are just two populations that interbred with each other and became not two distinct populations anymore. And so, like I said, you don't see them purebred Homo neanderthalis anywhere anymore, so in that sense they are extinct, but like I said, there's a little Neanderthal in all of us at this point. So, what do you think? Is that an extinct creature? Are Neanderthals extinct? What does it say? I don't know. And, like I said, I brought the buffalo out for a reason, the bison, because turns out most of what you would call a bison out in the wild at this point are not really bison anymore either at this point. So the population of bison got so low out in the wild that it became an issue of genetic diversity where creating a breeding population that was going to be sustainable was becoming a problem. And this is something that we can see where becoming endangered almost makes extinction more likely just in and of itself, even if action is taken, because lower population means lower genetic diversity, means more likely to catch diseases, more likely to get wiped out by some other random X factor. And so what has happened with bison is that pretty much every bison that exists out in the wild now is actually a hybrid species. Rather than being bison, they are, I don't know what the species is, the Latin name for it, but they're Bison Cow Hybrids, basically. The common name for them is beefalo. And there's only like 2 herds of like genetically pure bison out there these days, out in the wild. There's one in South Dakota and one in, I think it's Utah, that are pure bison. But otherwise, like all the bison that are in the Dakotas, other than that one particular herd, are all actually hybrids. And so, like I said, we think about it as bison as being this creature that's had this great recovery, like been at the brink of extinction and come back. But really, like if you're talking about, purebred bison, whatever that's worth, they're still there. There's only a couple thousand of them left out in the wild, period, like if that even, that are actually purebred bison. And so, but like I said, we like to talk about how they're this great success story where we've successfully managed this population back from the brink. And so that's the narrative that gets pushed, even though, like I said, you don't really see purebred bison anywhere out in the wild hardly anymore. And that's also something that's kind of interesting to talk about is when we're talking about the idea of endangered versus threatened, it's worth thinking about where those terms come from. How do we decide if something's endangered versus something is threatened versus something is a species of least concern? Like, who's making that decision and where do they come from, I think is a good question to ask. Because a lot of times you'll hear a figure like, oh, there's only, a 4-digit number of purebred bison out in the wild right now. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's a terrifying number to hear. That's so few probably. Is it so few? I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head how many there's supposed to be. I mean, I know there used to be more, but I don't know. So the figure I always like to cite, because I just happen to know how many of this animal there are out in the wild roughly right now, are lions. How many lions do you think there are out in the wild right now?
1,000.
1,000? I like that guess.
5,000.
5,000? There's about 20,000 lions that exist out in the wild right now. And that's a number where you hear 20,000 lions and you're like, is that a lot of lions? I wouldn't want to be in a room with 20,000 lions. That seems like it's bad. But you start thinking about it in the context of like, okay, lions are like big mammals, like, right? They live a long time. It makes sense there wouldn't be that many of them. But then, like, there's 7 billion people in the world. Compared to that, there's not very many lions at all. That's 20,000 people. That's Bemidji. Like, a Bemidji's worth of lions. in the whole world. And lions are a species that is considered like just on the brink of least concerned and threatened. This is another reason why it's a good species, because it's kind of right on that line. And 20,000, you would say, is, like I said, a relatively small number, seemingly, when you start thinking about other big mammals like humans. But then you think about, okay, 20,000 lions is barely threatened. Well, now what if I said there are 20,000 bees left in the wild? That's no bees. Like, those bees are extinct next year. Like, there can be 20,000 bees in a single hive. So, depending on the species, depending on the range, depending on how quickly they reproduce, it's hard to like really define what we mean when we say endangered or threatened or whatever, because it's so different from animal to animal. Basically, it's an assessment of how likely is it that this animal is going to become extinct within the foreseeable future if nothing is done about it. And so, like I said, it matters a lot depending on the species. And so we have an example here of a critter who is considered to be endangered. This is Sunny. And Sunny is a Sonoran desert tortoise, and she's a little sleepy right now. She's been hibernating for the last like 5 months. This is her debut back since last spring, or last fall, I mean. And Sunny is a Sonoran desert tortoise. Are we on camera with her? Okay. So, Sonoran desert tortoise. Sonoran desert tortoises are not in a particular quandary right now as far as like, there's not dramatically fewer Sonoran desert tortoises in the wild as there are supposed to be. But Sunny is still considered to be endangered, still a highly regulated species, because the area that Sunny lives in is small. And so if something were to happen to that specific area that Sonoran desert tortoises live in, it would be devastating to that population of Sonoran desert tortoises. The whole population lives within just like a 100-mile radius of one area in like southern Arizona and northern Mexico. So if something were to happen to that particular area, the whole species is done. And so because they are considered, because it's not done based on like a relative health of, a relative number of like how many there's supposed to be out in the wild, it's based on how likely is this animal to become extinct. She slips her way into endangered because, I said, she's vulnerable for a different reason rather than she's been like hunted to near extinction. And there is some human interference that's happened with them. They probably are a little lower than what they're supposed to be out in the wild. When you're talking about a creature like Sunny, and this is true for a lot of critters that have, this really specific range, it's more a matter of, we got to remember that if we do something to this, that species is out of here. They're done. And so Sunny's a great example of that. Now, we've talked about extinction, we've talked about going endangered, becoming threatened, we've talked about all that stuff. But truth of the matter is, the other side of the coin is a thing too. There's some creatures out there where we got too many of them. There's a lot of creatures out there where we got too many of them. And a lot of them are things that are human-cared things. So like domestic cats, for example. There's way more domestic cats in the world than what there's supposed to be. And we have some examples of that too. They're maybe a little bit lesser known. And again, it's probably, with both of these, again, it's a product of associations with people that have made them more common in more areas than what they're quote-unquote supposed to be. And so here we have Einstein, who is a leopard gecko. And normally, leopard geckos are supposed to be restricted to a relatively smallish area in like South Central Asia, kind of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan area is where they are native to. But leopard geckos now, because they are popular in the pet trade, are relatively common throughout like most of the tropics. They're invasive throughout most of Central America. Go to Hawaii and there's geckos of varying species all over the place. And so, great example of a critter that, largely again because of human action, has become way more common, has gone from being a species that had a healthy population out in the wild to now there's too many of them. And that's an issue in its own right too, because those geckos are competing with stuff in the areas they're in now. They're eating things, they're occupying spaces that previously something else was occupying, and so they create problems in that way. And similarly, again, thanks to humans, we have another critter here who has become kind of a problem species in a lot of places for having too many of them. And this is a ball python, so this is one of the more popular species of snake, and so a lot of people know ball pythons in particular because of how many of them there are now in the Everglades. And ball pythons are another great example of a species where, were they not a pet species, we would probably be talking about ball pythons as being in a similar situation to what Sunny's in, where it's like, okay, they occupy this relatively small, specific area in like sub-Saharan Western Africa, but because they got picked up and are popular as pets, all of a sudden they're everywhere, and there's too many of them now. And so, I say, it goes both ways. And I said a lot of it is because of humans, a lot of it is because of climate change, a lot of it is because of climate change caused by humans. And so, things like animals becoming near extinct. Like I said, this doesn't just apply to animals, it applies to plants, it applies to fungi, it applies to all sorts of things, where anything that's alive can go extinct. And so, let's see, anything else terribly, terribly exciting to talk about here? Any questions, comments, concerns? Yes? Can I come up and visit with the snake?
Why do two of the animals you show, like, the skin kind of looks like cheetah-like?
Okay. So he asked why two of the animals we showed have, he said cheetah-like, I assume you mean like spots. Great question. And so we have our leopard gecko here, which we describe it as leopard-like. And then we also have our ball python here that similarly has some kind of spots on the back. And you'll see spots and stripes and things like that as a pretty common pattern out in the wild. Basically, it's good camouflage in certain contexts. But the other thing that's kind of interesting with these guys is these are both critters that are popular as pets. And so one of the things that tends to happen with creatures that are popular as pets is we start to breed them to look a certain way. And so leopard geckos, for example, out in the wild, they have spots. They're not bright yellow, though. They're more of a tannish color, so they blend in more with their environment. She's pretty close to the wild morph with these guys. She looks a lot like the wild ones do. But yeah, it's for camouflage is ultimately where that's going. Great question. Anything else? You guys want to come up and visit with any of the live stuff? And come touch a snake? Or a turtle? So the turtle's out for the first time in months today. So you're the first one. You're the first guest to touch that tortoise in 5 months. Can you visit with Jeannie? There you go. And try just petting her first, and then want to put her on your shoulders? No? Fair enough. And so Jeannie is a ball python, like I mentioned, and originally an African species, but very popular as a pet. And they are known for being pretty docile snakes. That's generally kind of the air that they have. They're known for being kind of shy. They're nocturnal naturally, and so if you do get one as a pet, they tend to spend most of their time kind of hiding. And Jeannie is actually our senior snake here at the Science Center. We've had her for 9 years now. But we're not her first owners. We're, I think, her third owner at least. So she's probably 25 right now. She's getting up there for a ball python. Yeah, she's just a nice old lady who doesn't see very well, doesn't move around very much these days. Good snake to visit with for somebody who's a little nervous around snakes. She doesn't do much. Yeah, cool though. And so, chat doesn't have any questions. I think we'll sign off there. So, before I hit the end stream button, I gotta do my whole... So, thank you all for watching. Like I said, you can tune in every day at 3:30 and check out these shows. Like I said, it's a different educator every day, different topic every day. So, tune in one day and the topic's maybe not for you, and turn in the next day and maybe it will be. You can check us out on facebook.com/HeadwatersScienceCTR, twitch.tv/HeadwatersScienceCenter, or youtube.com/HeadwatersScienceCenter. Videos will be up on all three of those for the foreseeable future. Twitch deletes the video after a little while, but it'll be on YouTube and Facebook anyway. We are currently open, actually, so you notice we had a little bit of a live audience right now. So if you happen to come in at 3:30 on any of those days, you can come and sit in the audience and watch me do this live and potentially answer some questions, participate, get to touch a turtle maybe. And we would love to have you. I much prefer doing in front of live audience. It's much easier to get a little respond react from these guys over here versus you guys. I love you guys out on the internet, but you're slow to respond on a lot of stuff, if you respond at all. So come in and visit, get a little more dynamic experience. Otherwise, thank you for watching.